What you're about to hear is so raw it might leave you aching, tangled in the hush of sagebrush winds and the creak of old porch steps. It's a place where a man with no name finds purpose, and a woman with nothing left finds something worth fighting for. And it begins with a knock on a broken wagon. A moment barely noticed, but one that unearths everything. Here, in Ash and Vows. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Porch swing in Texas, kitchen in Colorado, or somewhere out on the long road west. We'd love to hear from you. The Arizona Territory in late August showed no mercy. The sun did not merely shine, it slammed into the earth like iron against steel, relentless and unforgiving. On that Tuesday, its full weight pressed down on Clara Boone, as if the land itself meant to test how much she could still endure. The air hung heavy with scorched sage and the sharp bite of heated dust. Clara stood alone on the rutted trail leading to her trading post at Boone's Crossing, 48 years old, her body worn thin by years of survival. These were hands that once danced across piano keys in an Eastern parlor. Now they were split, roughened, and locked tight around the splintered spokes of a wagon wheel. The wagon sagged beneath sacks of flour and feed, supplies she had bought with the last of her savings. The wheel, dry and brittle like everything else in this country, had slipped its rim. Clara drove her shoulder into the wood, jaw clenched hard enough to ache. "Come on," she whispered, her voice scraped raw by heat and dust. Just 1 inch. She pushed until her vision blurred, black flecks swimming at the edges. The wagon groaned, a deep wooden complaint, but it did not move. Clara staggered back, lungs burning, dragging her apron across her face to wipe away sweat and grit. She lifted her eyes to the sky, vast, blinding blue, uncaring. In that moment, the desert's silence was not calm. It was loud, accusing, a reminder of the empty chair at her table. 2 years since Eli Boone had died. 2 years of balancing ledgers alone. 2 years of mending fences. 2 years of sleeping with a loaded shotgun beside her bed. She missed him. Not sharply anymore, but deeply, like an old wound that never truly closed. Standing there, knees shaking, she realized it wasn't just his love she longed for. She missed his strength, the comfort of knowing she wasn't the last barrier between her home and the wild. "Lord," she murmured, the prayer slipping free before she could stop it. "I'm trying to be strong. I'm just so tired." She waited. Only the wind answered, sighing low through the mesquite. Then, hoofbeats. Hope sparked in her chest. She shielded her eyes against the glare, but the feeling iced over when she saw who it was. Not a neighbor. A spotless white horse stepped forward, proud and polished, carrying a man who looked untouched by the dust around him. Luther Crow, railroad land agent. A man whose suits cost more than her entire post. He halted 10 feet away and stayed mounted, looking down at her as though she were part of the ground. He didn't dismount, didn't offer a hand. He simply watched as she brushed dirt from her skirt. "Mrs. Boone," he drawled, tipping his hat. The gesture felt less like courtesy and more like mockery. "Looks like you're in a tight spot." Clara straightened, spine stiff with resolve. "Just a slipped rim, Mr. Crow. I've got it handled." Crow let out a dry chuckle. "Do you? Out here things break, wagons, fences?" He leaned forward in the saddle, resting his hands on the horn. "My offer still stands. Railroad pays cash. You could be back east in a month. Clean streets, easy living." "This is my home," Clara said evenly, "and it's not for sale." His smile never reached his eyes. "Price drops every week you make us wait, and this is dangerous country for a woman alone." He paused. Accidents happen. The threat lingered in the heat. Sharp, deliberate. Clara took a step forward. Good day, Mr. Crow. He lingered a moment longer, surveying her land as if it already belonged to him. Then he spurred his horse. Think on it, he called back, before the desert decides for you. Dust swallowed him whole. Clara coughed, waving it away, but the weight in her chest remained. The wagon seemed heavier now. The sun dipped lower, dragging long, bruised shadows across the road. She was alone. Truly alone. Clara returned to the wheel, gripping the rough wood as hot tears stung her eyes. She would not cry, not for Crow, not for anyone. She heaved again, a cry tearing from her throat. Nothing. Easy, ma'am. The voice came low and calm, out of nowhere. Clara spun, heart slamming hard. She hadn't heard a horse. A man stood just beyond the wagon, emerging from the settling dust. Tall, still, worn by the road. His clothes were a blend of worlds. Denim tucked into moccasins, a faded shirt, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. Dark hair tied back, streaked with gray. Her hand went instinctively to the small knife in her pocket. I don't have money, she said quickly. He raised his hands, palms open. I didn't ask for any. His eyes were dark, steady, carrying an old, quiet sorrow, but no malice. Without another word, he stepped past her, movements silent, controlled. He set down his pack and crouched by the wheel. Step back, he said. Clara obeyed. He placed his shoulder beneath the wagon bed, planted his feet, and lifted. The wagon rose smoothly, as if its weight meant nothing. Slide it. She rushed forward, shoved the wheel, and it snapped into place with a solid thud. Clear, she breathed. He lowered the wagon gently, like setting down something precious. Thank you, Clara said, voice shaking. He picked up his pack. His lips were cracked, his skin dry. Water? He asked. Yes, she said immediately. There's a pump by the house. As they walked, she offered, I'm Clara Boone. He paused, eyes on the horizon. Crow. And for the first time that day, the desert felt less empty. Clara Boone refused to shrink beneath his stare. She squared her shoulders and said, Just a slipped rim, Mr. Crow. I've got it under control. Luther Crow let out a dry chuckle, like dead leaves being crushed under a boot heel. Do you? He said, voice dipped in condescension. Out here things tend to fall apart. Wagons, fences. He leaned on his saddle horn, his expression unreadable. My offer still stands, Clara. The railroad pays in hard cash. You could be back east in a month. Sewing circles, brick streets. No more battling busted wheels in this God-forsaken dust. This is my home, she answered, voice steady even though her hands trembled. And it's not for sale, especially not for the pennies you're offering. Crow's smile hardened, the edge of it cutting sharper than sunlight off a knife blade. Price goes down each week you drag this out. And let's not forget, you're alone out here. This is dangerous country. His words dipped low, almost casual. Too casual. Accidents happen, ma'am. Wheels snap. Fires catch. Would be a real shame if something unfortunate made the decision for you. The threat hung in the air between them, hot and heavy. He wasn't predicting bad luck. He was making a promise. Clara stepped forward, her fingers knotting into her apron. Good day, Mr. Crow. He didn't move right away. His gaze swept over her land, like a man inspecting property already signed and deeded. Then, with a faint snort of disdain, he turned his horse. Think on it, he called over his shoulder. before the desert makes up your mind for you." He rode off, kicking up a choking plume of dust behind him. Clara coughed, waving it away, but the weight in her chest stayed put. She turned to look at the wagon. It felt impossibly heavier now. The sun was dipping low, dragging bruised shadows across the road like warning signs. She was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. She stepped back toward the wheel, her fingers wrapping around the dry wood. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, hot, angry tears. But she wouldn't let them fall. She wouldn't give Luther Crow the satisfaction. If she had to die trying, she'd move that damn wagon herself. She threw her shoulder into the wagon again, a guttural sound of frustration tearing from her throat. Still, nothing. "Easy there, ma'am." The voice came from nowhere, deep, steady, low like distant thunder. Clara Boone spun around, heart slamming against her ribs. She hadn't heard hoofbeats, no footsteps either. Just beyond the wagon, rising from the dust kicked up by Luther Crow's departure, stood a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of presence that made the ground feel smaller. He wore the dust of the land like a second skin. His clothes looked like they'd seen every kind of road. Denim trousers tucked into weather-worn moccasins, a faded calico shirt clinging to his frame, and a wide-brimmed hat casting shadow over his face. His hair, pulled back and streaked with gray, whispered of years spent walking under hard sun and harsher skies. Clara stepped back instinctively, fingers brushing the pocket knife in her apron. I don't have money," she said, voice catching. The stranger didn't step closer. He just raised his palms slightly. Open, non-threatening. "I'm not here for that," he said quietly. He glanced at the wagon, then back to her. His face was carved by time and wind, creased with a kind of silence that didn't beg to be filled. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Dark and steady, carrying a weight older than his years. There was no danger in them, only a quiet knowing. Without another word, he stepped past her. No request for permission, just a smooth, soundless motion, like a mountain cat that had learned to walk without making the earth notice. He dropped a worn canvas pack near the wheel. "Step back," he murmured. Clara hesitated, then obeyed. The man crouched low. He didn't groan, didn't grunt. No showing off. He simply wedged his shoulder beneath the heavy edge of the wagon bed, braced his legs, and pushed upward. Clara's breath caught. That wagon held nearly 300 pounds of flour and feed. She'd seen 2 grown men nearly throw their backs out trying the same lift last winter. But this stranger, he rose with it. A single, controlled breath leaving his lungs as the muscles in his back coiled and shifted beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. "Slide it," he said, voice tight but unshaken. Clara snapped into motion. She darted forward, gripped the wheel, and shoved. It rolled clean over the axle and locked into place with a loud, relieving clunk. They were strangers, but in that moment, they moved like a team. Clara snapped out of her daze. She rushed forward, gripped the wheel tight. With the weight lifted, she gave it a shove, and the rim popped clean over the axle, falling into place with a solid, satisfying clunk. "Clear!" she breathed out, chest rising and falling. The man lowered the wagon slowly, setting it down with the same care someone might use to lay a sleeping child in bed. He exhaled deep, then stood, rolling his shoulder once with a quiet ease. Neither of them spoke. The wind passed through the sagebrush like it always did, but something had shifted. The threat Luther Crow had left behind still hung in the air, but now it felt manageable, replaced by a weight that felt strangely grounding. Heavy, yes, but not dangerous. "Thank you," Clara said at last, voice unsteady. I don't know how long I would have been stuck out here." The man picked up his pack. His lips were cracked, skin drawn dry from long travel. "Water?" he asked. Just one word, no demand in it, just need. "Yes," Clara replied quickly. "Of course. There's a pump by the house. Cold water." He gave her a slight nod, then began walking toward the porch, leading his horse alongside him. The paint was a tough beast, stocky, trail-worn, same as its rider. Clara kept pace beside him, stealing glances from the corner of her eye. "I'm Clara Boone," she offered quietly. He paused, eyes drawn to the far-off rim of the horizon, where the sky was bleeding into burnt orange. "Crow," he said simply. They reached the porch. Clara hurried ahead, grabbed the tin cup by the pump, and worked the handle until the water ran cold and clear. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers, rough on rough, skin to skin. He drank in long, steady pulls. Then, without a word, refilled the tin and poured it into his hat for the horse. Clara watched him. He wasn't some beggar drifting for scraps. He carried himself with a certain gravity, too much dignity for pity. He moved like a man who'd once carried a rifle, or maybe a warrior who'd put it down, but never truly left the fight behind. She looked up at the roof of her trading post, shingles still missing from last week's storm. And an idea began to form. The roof above the trading post still bore the scars of last week's storm, shingles ripped clean off by desert wind. Clara had been putting off fixing it, dreading the climb, the risk, the loneliness of doing it alone. "Mr. Crow," she said, voice tentative. He turned, wiping the back of his hand across his mouth. "I can't offer you much," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness in her tone. "But there's a roof that needs mending, a barn full of muck. I can give you hot meals, a place to sleep up in the loft, and I pay fair." Crow looked at the roof first. Not a glance, but a measured scan. His eyes sharp, quiet, heavy with years of reading trouble in a landscape. Then he looked at her. He saw her hands, still trembling from the weight of the day, the stoop in her shoulders. And maybe, just maybe, he saw the fear Luther Crow had left behind, like smoke on her porch. He didn't smile, didn't flatter, just gave a slow nod. "The roof first," he said quietly, "before the rain finds its way back." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, one she'd been gripping inside her chest for 2 long years. Crow unrolled his pack and laid it on the top porch step, slow and deliberate. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the far ridge, painting the land in twilight, Clara knew 2 things with certainty. The desert was still dangerous, and the debts she owed were still due. But as the first star cut through the deepening dusk, something changed inside her. She wasn't standing in the dark alone anymore. Out in the high desert, time usually worked backwards, always measuring what's been lost. Peeling paint, rotting timbers, the slow crawl of dry creek beds, hope eroding grain by grain. For 2 years, Clara had watched the life she built with Eli Boone unravel, piece by piece. But something shifted after Crow arrived. It wasn't some blazing miracle. It was the kind of resurrection that came quietly, in the rhythm of an axe striking ironwood, in the sound of nails being eased from warped boards, one morning at a time. She found herself waking different. The sunrise used to mean dread, another battle waiting outside the door. Now it came with the sound of boots crunching on hard-packed dirt and the metallic clink of tools being carried out with purpose. Before Clara even had her apron tied, she'd hear him moving out there. Steady, grounded. She watched through the kitchen window as she kneaded dough for bread, her eyes tracing his frame as he bent to his work. Crow didn't wrestle the land into submission. He worked with it, the way a man does when he's learned the hard way that nature can't be tamed, only respected. When he fixed the corral fence, he didn't just plug gaps. He anchored each post with stone from the creek bed, bound the wire tight like it meant something. And as he worked, he hummed, a low, guttural tune the wind never let her fully hear. He was a man of few words, but every move he made told a story. Their talks, when they happened, were plain and to the point, shared over noonday beans and cornbread. "Roof's holding," Crow might murmur, or "horse needs chewing." Clara would nod, pour him another helping of coffee, which he accepted with nothing more than a slight dip of his chin. But it wasn't the work talk that stirred her. It was the quiet moments, the shift between the blaze of day and the hush of twilight. That had always been the loneliest stretch, when the walls of her house seemed to lean in, pressing close with all the things left unsaid. 4 days after Crow arrived, that silence started to change. The sun was lowering. The wind carried the sharp tang of pine sap, mingling with the rich, earthy scent of fresh coffee drifting from her kitchen. Clara stepped out onto the porch, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. Crow was sitting on the bottom step, whittling cedar. He paused when the screen door creaked behind her, lifting his gaze. He'd washed the dust from his face at the pump, slicked his dark hair back, tied out of the way. His features, sharpened by sun and wind, were clearer in the softening light. Clara hesitated, then walked forward. "I thought, maybe you'd like something warm. The night air thins out quick." He laid the wood and knife aside and rose to his feet. Not out of formality. It felt instinctual, like something he did out of respect. Despite the calluses, the worn edges, he accepted the mug with quiet care. "Thank you, ma'am." "Clara," she said softly, "please, if you're patching my roof, you can call me by my name." He looked at her over the rim of the mug, steam curling around his face. "Clara," he repeated, slow and grounded, like he meant it. It sounded different from him, steadier. Clara settled into the rocking chair, Thomas's old seat. The wood groaned under her weight, familiar and bitter-sweet. Crow sat back down on the step, keeping a respectful space between them, his back to her, eyes on the road. They didn't speak. Before, silence with a stranger would have made Clara itch with nerves. She would have filled the space with talk of weather, of crops, of whatever came easy. But this silence was something else. It was full, but not with fear. It wrapped around them like a quilt. Warm, present. The only sounds were the chirr of crickets rising in the sage, the soft creak of her rocking chair, and the occasional quiet sip of coffee. Her eyes lingered on the slope of his shoulders. Broad, taut, always coiled as if ready for movement. And still, for once, perfectly still. And still. Crow didn't move. Not a twitch in his shoulders. Not even a blink. And for the first time in 2 years, Clara Boone didn't feel the need to watch the road, to scan the tree line for trouble, to brace for the next blow. That weight had shifted. She realized it with a start. So suddenly she nearly spilled her coffee. He was doing the watching now. And she felt safe. It was a dangerous feeling, safety. It made you believe in things, made you hope. But as the first stars lit up that velvet dusk above the mesa, Clara closed her eyes and breathed in deep, the scent of sage, dust, and fresh coffee. And on the steps below, silent as dusk itself, Crow sat like an anchor in the wind. But peace, out in the desert, doesn't last. Not when men like Luther Crow walk the same earth. 3 mornings later, the reminder came. No warning, no shout, just the quiet, sickening thud of heartbreak. Clara had woken early, basket in hand, planning to gather what was left of the late summer tomatoes. Her garden was small, a patch she'd coaxed from stubborn earth, 1 bucket of water at a time. It was her pride, her winter food, her one green miracle. She rounded the side of the house and froze. The basket dropped from her hands. The garden was gone. Not eaten, not nibbled at by deer or trampled by coyotes. There were boot prints. Human. Every tomato plant was stomped flat. Green fruit crushed into wet red smears across dry soil. The squash vines had been ripped up by the roots and hurled against the siding. But the worst was the water barrel, the big oak cask that caught rain from the roof. It lay splintered on its side, staves caved in, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. The wet earth around it mocked her, drinking up the precious water she'd saved for weeks. No. Clara's voice came out in a whisper. Her hands flew to her mouth. Oh, God. No. The tears hit fast, hot, stinging, sharp as mesquite thorns. It wasn't just vegetables. It was her labor, her hope. It was someone saying, nothing you grow, nothing you build is safe. Luther Crow hadn't come himself, but his hand had reached through the dark. A message left in the soil and splinters. He could take her food, her water, her peace, any time he pleased. Clara sank to her knees in the ruined mud. She picked up one of the crushed tomatoes, held it like something sacred. Her shoulders shook with each sob that broke loose. She felt small, foolish even, for thinking a mended roof meant anything out here. She didn't hear Crow coming, but he was there. But even before she heard his steps, Clara felt the weight of his shadow settle over her. Crow didn't speak right away. He didn't offer soft lies like, it'll be all right, or we'll plant again. He knew, same as she did. The growing season was done. There'd be no more tomatoes this year. He crouched beside her, silent. He didn't reach for her, didn't touch. Somehow he seemed to know she'd break if he did. But his presence, it shielded her from the rising sun, from the broken world at her knees. Crow, Clara rasped out, wiping at her face with mud-slick hands. Luther Crow did this. Crow stood slowly. His face was unreadable, carved in stone, but his eyes burned. He walked to the far edge of the wrecked garden and crouched low, studying the prints pressed deep into the earth. His fingers, dark and scarred, ran lightly through the chaos in the dirt. 3 men, he said quietly. Too quiet. Came in from the North Ridge, left their horses near the wash, walked in on foot. He rose, crossed to the busted water barrel, knelt again, ran a hand over the shattered wood. Clara stood there, throat dry. Why? She asked. Her voice cracked. Why do this? Why ruin food? Why the water? It's cowardice, she whispered. It's just cruel. Crow turned to her, eyes hard now. The sadness was gone, replaced by something sharpened, like flint struck for fire. That's exactly what it is, he said. A wolf doesn't stalk and not strike. A wolf kills to eat. He paused, voice low and edged with heat. A coyote? He'll kill to survive. But this... He swept a hand toward the ruin. This is the work of a frightened dog trying to act like a predator. These men, they ain't hunters. His voice dropped. They're cowards. They tear at what can't fight back. Then he stepped toward her, held out his hand. Clara looked at it, calloused, scarred, solid. She placed her fingers in his. He pulled her to her feet with a strength that didn't jolt, but lifted. And for one breathless second, she felt like the weight of the world had slipped away. "Go on inside," he said, voice soft now. "Wash your face. Start the coffee." "What about you?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Crow's gaze drifted back to the tracks. "To find out if dogs leave trails," he said. A spike of fear shot through Clara's chest. She thought he was going to ride out. Thought he meant to track them alone, maybe not come back. "I'm moving my things," Crow said, voice level. Her heart sank. "You're leaving?" "No," he answered. And the word rang through her like a church bell at midnight. "I'm moving my bedroll," he said. "Been sleeping in the barn. Too far to hear boots in the dark." He looked toward the ridge, where the tracks had come from, where trouble still lingered like smoke. "From now on, I sleep on the porch, by the door." Clara stared at him. He wasn't just offering protection. He was offering himself, his body, his presence, as a wall between her and whatever walked in shadow. "You don't have to do that," she whispered. This isn't your fight." Crow turned to her, and for the first time since he'd stepped onto her land, something close to a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Tight, grim, but real. "You gave me water when I was dry," he said. "Gave me shelter when I had none." He paused, voice dropping low. "That makes it my fight." Something changed in the house after that. The air felt different. Not the fear of Luther Crow hanging over them anymore, but something sharper, more electric. They weren't just woman and hired hand now. They were standing the same line, partners behind the same barricade. A week passed. Late afternoon light filtered through the backroom windows of the trading post, slanting across shelves and crates, turning dust in the air into golden flecks. Clara sat on a stool, sewing basket in her lap. "Hold still," she murmured. Crow stood in front of her. Still, but clearly uneasy. He'd caught the side of his shirt on a rusted nail fixing the corral gate. Long tear, ugly and wide. He'd tried to hide it, but she'd noticed. And once she noticed, she'd insisted. "It's fine," he'd grumbled. "Just a shirt." "It's your only shirt, Crow," she'd snapped back. "And I won't have you walking around like a patched-up scarecrow. Now stand still." And so he stood, shirtless. The torn fabric lay in her hands, his broad chest rising and falling steady in front of her. The heat still lingered in the room, pressing in through the walls as the late afternoon light began to soften. Clara threaded her needle, failing to keep her focus on the cloth in her lap. But her eyes betrayed her. They drifted toward the man standing just feet away. She'd always known he was strong. She'd seen him lift wagons, haul logs, carry what others couldn't. But now, with the loose calico shirt stripped away, what she saw wasn't just strength. It was a story, a map, etched in skin and silence. His chest and arms were corded with lean muscle, darkened by years under an unforgiving sun. But it was his back that caught her breath in her throat. He shifted slightly, gazing out the window. And that's when the light hit him. Old scars laced across his shoulder blades like faded lightning strikes. Some were thin, silver-white, knife wounds maybe, or briars. Others were round and puckered, unmistakable. Bullets, but two marks stood out. Deep, clean, brutal, whip scars. Clara's hand froze. The needle hovered over the fabric, forgotten. "Crow," she whispered, his name slipping from her lips before she knew she'd spoken. He stiffened, didn't turn. But his posture went taut, like a wild thing catching a scent on the wind. "I told you," he said. voice gravel rough. "It's just skin." "No, it's not," Clara said quietly. She laid the shirt down across her lap, her heart heavy. What she saw wasn't just flesh. It was survival. Pain. Carried and endured. "Those are war marks," she murmured. He turned slowly to face her. His jaw was tight, eyes guarded. "I've lived a long time, Clara," he said. "The world leaves its mark." "Were you a soldier?" she asked gently. Crow let out a low, bitter sound, not quite a laugh. "I was a scout." He paused. "For the army." Clara's eyes widened. She didn't speak, but the weight of what that meant settled between them like thunder. "An Apache scout," he said, his voice flat. "For the U.S. Army." She didn't need more explanation. She'd heard enough tales, knew what that role cost a man, caught between worlds, never truly belonging to either. "I thought," he started, then looked down at his hands, rough and scarred. Whatever he'd meant to say, he let it die in silence. He struggled for the words, jaw tight with the weight of what he carried. "I thought, if I helped them, if I led them through the canyons, I could keep the peace," Crow said, voice gravel thin. "I figured maybe I could get the soldiers to speak before they shot, and maybe I could get my people to believe that fighting was a war they couldn't win." He looked up then, his eyes catching Clara's. What she saw there was bottomless, a grief without end. "I was wrong," he said simply. "The army took my eyes, used them to find hidden camps. But when I begged them to stop, when I asked for mercy, they stopped hearing me." He shook his head slowly. "And my people, to them I'm nothing, a ghost, a traitor." His voice dropped, so low she had to lean in. "I walked between two worlds, Clara, and both of them cut me open." The silence that followed was thick as blood in the dust. He wasn't just a man with scars. He was a man who'd tried to hold the middle ground and been crushed by both sides. A man who'd given everything and been left with nothing. No tribe, no uniform, no country. Just road dust and pain. "I've got no home," he said, barely above a whisper. "I'm just a drifter, passing through, waiting for the wind to shift." Clara rose to her feet. The shirt in her lap slipped to the floor, forgotten. She stepped toward him. The space that always stood between them, guarded and deliberate, was gone. She could feel the warmth of him now, smell the clean scent of soap and smoke and cedar that clung to his skin. Her hand lifted, pale, slightly trembling. She reached toward him. Crow's breath caught, his chest rising, hesitating. He looked like he might step back, vanish into the safety of solitude. But he didn't. He stayed right there. Clara's fingertips brushed his forearm. Then, slowly, settled over his hand. Her touch was light, gentle, but it hit like lightning. It was a bridge built between two long, broken shores, a step over a chasm both of them had been standing beside for years. "You're not a ghost, Crow," she whispered. He looked down, staring at her hand covering his, her skin soft against his roughness. The contrast startled something deep inside him. Then she looked up, right into him. Her blue eyes weren't soft. They were fierce now. Fierce with truth. "And you're not just passing through," she said. "Look around you. This house. That fence." "Look at the garden," Clara whispered, her voice steady now. "Look at the ground you're helping me turn back into something that lives. You're part of this place." She gave his hand a firm squeeze. Grounding. Certain. "You belong here, Crow, for as long as you want to stay. You're not just a drifter to me." And for a breathless moment, time stopped inside that dusty back room of Boone's Crossing. The world outside, crickets, wind, creaking timber, faded until all that remained was the sound of their breathing, and something unspoken passing between them like lightning through soil. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't the kind of fire shouted from rooftops or scribbled in letters. It was deeper. It was an anchor, sinking quietly into the earth. Crow turned his hand over, slowly, fingers threading through hers. His grip was tentative, like he was holding something too delicate for a man built to bear scars. "As long as I want it," he repeated softly, barely more than breath. "As long as you want it," Clara echoed. And with that, the stone he'd worn across his face began to crumble. The hardness around his eyes softened. The tension in his frame melted away, and for the first time since she'd met him, he didn't look like a man halfway out the door. He looked like someone who had finally set a burden down. "Then I'm not going anywhere," he said. And there, in that quiet space filled with dust and heat and mended cloth, something was sealed between them. This was no longer just about survival, no longer just about standing against Luther Crow. They had fallen for each other, quietly, without need for words. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real, undeniable, like the turning of the earth or the coming of dawn. Clara picked up the shirt again, threading her needle once more. And as she sewed, she knew. The fight for Boone's Crossing was about to grow harder, because now she had something far more precious to lose. Out in the high desert, when the moon hides behind thick clouds, night becomes a thing of total darkness. No shadows, no shapes, just a velvet black silence that swallows the land whole. It's when good folks are curled under quilts and dreaming of spring, and when the things that creep and scheme come slithering out of that ink-stained void. That night, the air around Boone's Crossing felt tight, too still, like a bowstring drawn back, trembling, waiting for the release. Clara Boone was asleep inside, but not soundly. Her dreams were twisted, of wheels snapping and fences buckling. But out on the porch, lying flat on the wooden planks just outside her door, Crow did not sleep. Crow lay still on the porch, his breath shallow and steady, but his eyes were wide open. He wasn't sleeping. He was listening. The wind curled softly over the desert flats, brushing across Boone's Crossing like a whispered warning. Then he heard it. Not the skitter of a lizard, not the soft pads of a coyote. No, this was heavier. A boot step, deliberate, muffled, the crunch of gravel underweight. A man trying too hard to be quiet. Crow didn't stir, didn't reach for the Winchester leaning against the wall. That would make too much noise. Instead, his hand slid beneath the blanket, fingers wrapping tight around the worn handle of his knife. In one fluid motion, he rolled off the porch and vanished into the shadows beneath the eaves, the very roof he'd repaired days ago. And that's when he smelled it. Coal oil. Sharp. Acidic. A bitter promise of destruction. Luther Crow had made his move. The railroad man had run out of patience. Threats hadn't broken the widow. So now he meant to burn her out. 3 shapes peeled away from the darkness near the barn. They carried torches, unlit for now, and jugs heavy with kerosene. They moved like drunks pretending to be hunters, tripping over the hard-packed earth, cursing under their breath. Just hired hands, dead spur men from the saloon, paid to frighten a woman. They didn't know someone was watching. A man who once crossed enemy lines without leaving a single print behind. The first one reached the porch corner. He uncorked the jug, sloshing oil against the brittle wood siding. "Light it up," he hissed. The second one struck a match. It flared in his hand, brief, blinding orange in the dark. But before flame could meet oil, a hand lashed out from the black. Fast. Silent. Crow didn't fight like a barroom brawler. He struck like a rattler. He seized the wrist holding the match and twisted, sharp and sudden. The man yelped, the flame falling to the dust and sputtering out. "Who's there?" the third man barked, reaching for the gun at his hip. Crow stepped into the edge of the light. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. He moved. Quick, clean, brutal. He swept the second man's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the dirt. The third man fumbled with his pistol, hands shaking. But Crow was already inside his guard. A sharp, open-hand strike to the chest knocked the wind clean out of the man. His pistol clattered against the hard-packed dirt. This wasn't a brawl. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a dismantling. The difference between a man who throws punches for coin and a man who fights to protect what's his. Inside the house, Clara Boone bolted upright with a gasp. The shout had torn through her dream like a bullet through glass. Then came the smell. Kerosene. Faint smoke, acrid and unmistakable. The echo of a match snuffed before it ever burned. Fear clawed at her throat. "They're here," her mind screamed. "They've come to finish it." For a split second, instinct screamed for her to hide, to crouch in the dark, wait it out. But then she remembered the man sleeping on her porch. She remembered the scars on his back, and the promise in his eyes. He was out there, fighting. For her. "No," Clara whispered into the dark. "Not tonight." She flung off the quilt. Not for a robe, not for comfort. Her hand reached for the heavy, double-barrel shotgun that had once belonged to Eli Boone. She cracked it open by feel, checked the shells, snapped it shut with a sound that spoke louder than words. Then she threw open the front door, and the yard lit up in frozen chaos. One man writhed in the dirt, clutching his side. Another scrambled backward, trying to get to his feet. Crow stood between them, chest heaving, knife drawn, low and steady. He wasn't charging. He was holding, defending. But at the edge of the yard, a fourth figure rode into view. Luther Crow. He was on horseback, gripping a lit torch in his hand. "Burn it!" Crow roared, his slick railroad polish unraveling into pure fury. "Burn it all down!" And with that, he hurled the torch. It arched high through the night air, sparks trailing behind it like a cursed comet. It didn't hit the house. It landed in the pile of dry hay stacked against the porch. Flames erupted fast, roaring, bright, hungry. Crow whirled toward the blaze, ready to stamp it out. But the men on the ground saw their opening. They lunged. "Get back!" The voice that followed was thunder. Clara Boone stepped to the edge of the porch, firelight flickering against the hem of her white nightgown and the glint of cold steel in her hands. She leveled the shotgun square at Luther Crow's chest. "Get off my land!" she shouted, and pulled the trigger. She aimed high. The blast split the night like a thunderclap, tearing through the cottonwood branches above Crow's head. His horse reared, panicked by the roar and the blaze, nearly throwing him into the dirt. The dead spurmen froze. Their eyes jumped from the wild, unrelenting power of Crow, still standing in the yard like a stone sentinel, to the furious woman in white, backlit by fire, a shotgun smoking in her hands. She was no helpless widow. She was a warning. She was a line in the sand. "Go," one of them cried, scrambling backward into the shadows. But it was already too late. The gunshot had done more than startle their horses. In the silence of the desert, sound travels fast, miles even. And fire? Fire calls out to everyone. Lanterns began to swing in the dark, bouncing in rhythm with approaching hoofbeats. From the road to town, lights flared like stars being born. "Hold it right there!" The voice was firm, commanding. Sheriff Clay Turner rode into the yard, pistol drawn, eyes sweeping the scene. Behind him came the neighbors, the Millers, the Smiths. Even old Ruth Calder pulled up in her buggy, reins tight in her weathered hands. They'd seen the fire from their homesteads, heard the echo of Clara's shotgun. Now the yard swelled with bodies and light. Without needing instruction, the neighbors jumped down from saddles and wagons, grabbing blankets, buckets from the trough, anything they could find. They rushed the flames, licking up the porch steps, stamping, dousing, shouting. In minutes, the fire hissed and choked into steam. Smoke curled up from charred wood, but the house still stood. Sheriff Turner took it all in. The spilled kerosene, the battered ground, the dead spur men trying to slink away into the sagebrush. But Hank Miller and his sons cut them off, rifles in hand. Then Sheriff Turner turned his gaze toward the source, toward Luther Crow, still astride his horse, knuckles white on the reins, face pale under the lantern light. Then, finally, the sheriff looked to the porch. And there he saw her. Clara Boone, standing tall but trembling now as the adrenaline drained from her limbs, lowering the shotgun. And beside her, like a shadow that had learned to protect instead of follow. Crow, silent, steady, unshaken. The Apache drifter wasn't holding a weapon anymore. His hand rested lightly on Clara Boone's shoulder. Steady, grounding. The folks of Boone's Crossing had spent years trading whispers about men like Crow. Words like savage, stranger, and trouble had followed him in the shadows. But tonight, the picture was clear as day. On one side, a railroad man with money in his pockets and kerosene on his hands. Luther Crow, polished boots dusted with ash, reeking of cologne and cowardice. On the other, a so-called drifter, a man marked by silence and scars, standing as the only thing between a woman and the fire, meant to break her. The old fear, the prejudice that had choked this town for years, began to vanish, swept away by smoke and truth. "Well," Sheriff Clay Turner muttered, eyes cold as he looked up at Crow. "Mr. Crow, looks like you've got a whole mess to answer for." He let that hang a beat. Arson, attempted murder, trespassing. "She's just a stubborn woman," Crow snapped, face flushed, hand shaking as he pointed at Clara. "She's standin' in the way of progress." "She's standin' in her home," came a voice from the crowd. Sharp, clear. It was Ruth Calder. "And she's got better company than you ever brought, Silas." The sheriff holstered his weapon and stepped toward Crow's horse. "Get down," he said flatly. "You'll be sleeping behind bars tonight." Luther Crow didn't go easy. He shouted, raged, spat threats into the wind. But no one listened. No one cared. He was dragged off into the dark, all fire gone from him now. And when it was over, the townsfolk turned toward the porch. But they didn't look at Crow with fear. Hank Miller gave him a slow nod. Quiet, solid, man to man. Respect. Crow didn't smile. He just nodded back. His hand stayed where it was, resting gently on Clara's shoulder. The sun always rises different after a storm. Brighter. Sharper. Like the world's been scrubbed raw and honest. That morning, Boone's Crossing smelled of damp ash and fresh coffee. The porch bore scars, blackened boards, peeled paint, but the house still stood. It had held. The neighbors had gone home in the early hours, promising to return with tools and lumber. The sheriff had ridden out with Crow and the dead spur men locked up tight. It was done. The siege had ended. Clara stood in her kitchen, fingers wrapped around a warm mug. Her hands still trembled, just barely. The silence in the house had returned. But this time it didn't feel hollow. It felt earned. It felt hollow. Clara hadn't seen Crow since first light. And now something cold began curling in her gut. The danger was gone. The fire snuffed out. The porch repaired. Luther Crow locked away. The war was over. And men like Crow, men made of silence and scars, didn't stay after wars ended. He walked fences at dawn, slept light as a whisper, kept his knife close and his heart far. What reason did he have to stay now? He was a warrior, and warriors moved on. Clara set her coffee down too hard. The cup rattled against the table. She didn't care. She moved fast to the front door, flung it open, and there he was, by the hitching post. Crow's paint horse was saddled and ready, bedroll tied down, saddlebags buckled, no wasted motion, no noise. He was leaving, just like he came. Quiet, efficient, without goodbye. Clara stepped off the porch. Her boots crunched on the gravel. Her throat felt raw. She tried to keep her chin high, to wear the same steel she'd faced down Luther Crow with, but it cracked the second she spoke. "The road callin' you back?" she asked, voice thin, brittle as frostbit glass. Crow paused. He didn't turn right away. He checked the cinch, gave the horse a soft pat on the neck. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. His hat was in his hands. He looked at her, really looked, the shadows under her eyes, the way she wrapped her arms around herself like the wind had cut through her bones. "Clara," he said quietly. "I understand," she cut in. Too fast. She had to say it now, or she'd break. "You did what you came here to do. You fixed the roof. You saved this place. Me." Her voice faltered, then pushed forward. "You don't owe me nothing. I can pay you your wages, and then you can go." Crow frowned, deepening the weathered lines on his face, his brow knit in quiet confusion. "Go?" he repeated. She nodded, eyes brimming. "To wherever you were headed before you found me." Her voice cracked. "Back to the road." Crow looked at the saddlebags, but his eyes weren't on the gear. They were somewhere else entirely. Then he looked back at her, and something shifted in Crow's eyes, a realization soft and heavy like first light breaking across a ridge. He took one step, then another, until he was standing in front of her, close enough that his shadow cast across her like shelter. "The road's got nothing left for me, Clara," he said, voice low and thick with feeling. "I walked it for 10 years. It's cold. It's lonely. And it never leads anywhere worth going." "But," she stammered, motioning toward the saddled horse, to the packed gear. Your bedroll." Crow gently took her hands in his. His grip was solid, warm, like calloused earth that refused to break. "I was packing tools," he said steady. "I was checking the perimeter. Luther Crow's got friends, men who don't sleep easy. I wanted to make sure the trail was clear, so the neighbors could come back without fear." Clara stared at him. Her heart hammered in her chest, hope fighting to outrun fear. You're not leaving?" Crow shook his head. "I told you," he said, voice grounding her like the weight of the world finally easing. "I'm not a drifter anymore." He released one of her hands and turned to his saddlebag. With quiet purpose, he unbuckled it and pulled out his rolled-up bedroll. "But I am done sleeping on the porch," he added with a glint of dry humor. "Wood's too damn hard, and the cold hits just before dawn." He walked past her, boots thudding up the scorched porch steps. Clara turned with him, watching, her breath catching in her throat, but not from pain. This was something else. This was joy, real and sudden, and terrifying in its beauty. Crow stepped inside the trading post. He didn't pause in the doorway. He moved to the row of old wooden hooks by the wall, the ones Eli Boone used to hang his coat after long days riding fence. Crow unrolled the bedroll, not on the floor. He laid it carefully on the bench. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached up. and removed his wide-brimmed hat, the one that had shaded him through 1,000 miles of sun and silence. He hung it on the hook. That was all. But it said everything. It meant he was done watching for danger. It meant he wasn't halfway gone. It meant he was home. He turned back toward the door. Clara stood in the frame, sunlight blazing behind her, eyes wide, hand still gripping the edge of the post like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. He gave her the faintest smile. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice softer now, a real smile curling at the corners of his mouth. Clara laughed. Quiet, breathless. It trembled a bit, but it was bright and warm and real. "Yes," she said, her eyes shining. "Coffee." She turned and walked inside, the screen door clicking shut behind her. It shut out the desert heat, the dust, the memory of fire and fear. Later that morning, as the Arizona sun climbed high and merciless, anyone riding past Boone's Crossing might have noticed the blackened wood near the porch, the scorch marks lingering on the side of the house. But they'd also see something else. 2 figures standing by the newly mended fence. Not a widow and a hired hand, but a man and a woman, shoulders squared, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the land before them. Together. The wind still moved through the sagebrush, same as it always had. But it didn't sound so lonely anymore. It sounded like something kept, like a promise made beneath stars and firelight, and kept with bare hands, sweat, and quiet love. And that's the true story of Clara Boone and Crow. Not just a tale of fire and ruin, but of finding shelter not in walls, but in another soul. Because sometimes, what saves us isn't the roof overhead. It's the person who chooses to stay, who hangs their hat beside yours, who says, with quiet steadiness, "I'm not leavin'," and means it. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso Legal. Disclaimer: our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully, only to support production, while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.